Bruno is a professor of demography at Louvain in Belgium. He received his PhD from Louvain in 2001 and then worked as a postdoc both at the University of Montreal and at the University of Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. His research interests are focused on demographic methods, data collection, fertility and international migration, a hot topic, and his area of work is primarily focused in sub-Saharan Africa. He has been involved in the design and implementation of surveys in Kinshasa, Dakar, and Accra, and is involved in various initiatives, including migration between Africa and Europe, but also monitoring and evaluation of adolescent reproductive health initiatives in a different part of the world, in Asia. His work on fertility in particular includes research on data quality, methods for analyzing birth histories, adolescent fertility estimates, male fertility analysis, and what he's going to talk about today, which is research on fertility stalls focused on capital cities in sub-Saharan Africa. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the mic over to Bruno.
So hello, everyone. Good morning, I think, for most of you. Let's share the screen. Okay, should work. Yep. Yes. Okay. So, well, I'm not very used to Zoom, so I may have some troubles navigating in it, but I think it should work. Well, first, thank you for attending this seminar, and thank you for inviting me to give this this talk. So I will talk about fertility stalls in sub-Saharan Africa, and especially fertility stalls in urban areas and in cities, and the impact these stalls have on global fertility trends at the country level and in Africa as a whole. And this is a joint work with David Sanchez, who is a postdoctoral researcher here in Louvain-la-Neuve. And yeah, and who is not here, but who participated in the work. I just want to mention that since English is not my native language, I will use sometimes my notes. So don't be surprised if you see me reading. Sometimes I need my safety net, but I try not to read too much. So I will start with a few words on how I started working on this project. So a few years ago, we had a small project with the World Bank with Philippe Bocquier, also a colleague of mine, on demographic trends in sub-Saharan Africa. And Philippe Bocquier focused on migration to cities, working mainly with census data. And I worked on the fertility trends in urban areas in Africa with demographic and health surveys mainly. And after a few weeks of analysis, we bumped into somewhat unexpected findings. Well, they were not completely unexpected because we had worked on related issues, but we were surprised by some of the results. Philippe found that migration to urban areas had leveled off, and actually that urban growth in Africa, not everywhere, but in many sub-Saharan African countries, was largely driven by natural increase. And well, he later worked with Ashira, Menashe, Oren, and confirmed this with other data sets, and they will soon publish their work. And from my side, I focused on the fertility declines, and I found that in many cities, fertility declines had slowed down or stopped at levels much higher than 2 children per woman in many cities. Well, I was aware that this was happening in Africa because I had worked on fertility stalls at the country level, but still I was struck by the fact that these stalls were so frequent. And so when David Sanchez joined UCL, we decided to work a little bit more on this topic. And this is what I'm going to present now. And before working on this topic, I thought maybe a little bit naively that the decline would be fairly smooth and would broadly follow the three-stage pattern that was described by Shapiro and Tambache, but by other authors also. But Shapiro and Tambache, in their paper in 2000 on urban fertility, described that pattern. And in the first stage, fertility starts declining in urban areas. Then in the second stage, it starts declining in rural areas, but at a lower pace than in urban areas. And finally, in the third stage, fertility declines more rapidly in rural than in urban areas. So this is sometimes referred to as the leader-follower model. And in this case, the countrywide trend would fall somewhere between these trends, and the speed of the decline at the country level would depend both on the speed of the decline in urban and rural areas, and on the speed of urbanization. So in this example, urbanization is slow. It goes from 30% to 45%, but if it's faster, the countrywide trend will be a little faster. So in this case, from 30 to 60%. So we can generalize this pattern to separate capital cities, other urban areas, and rural areas. And capital cities often have lower fertility for a variety of reasons, including because women are better educated. They want less children, partly because the cost of children are higher in cities, but also because of better access to contraception, to name a few. So if we separate large cities or capital cities from the rest of urban areas, the model could look like this. And again, the countrywide trend would fall somewhere between these curves. And well, of course, this is a model, and we did not expect real world trends to be exactly like this. But actually, it turned out that the trends were much more diverse than this pattern suggests. And as I will show, the broad hierarchy was found almost everywhere. So fertility first declines in capital cities, then in other urban areas, and then in rural areas. It's not always, but almost always the case. But the trends were much less smooth than this model suggests. And more importantly, the level at which fertility decline had slowed down or stopped in cities or in urban areas is sometimes much higher than 2 children per woman, sometimes 3, 4, or even 5 in some cases. So, as I said, this was not completely unexpected. There has been a number of work that have shown that Africa's fertility transitions are different from what was observed in other regions. So as summarized by John Bongart, fertility declines started later in Africa than elsewhere, from higher fertility levels. It has overall also been slow, even if fertility decline started earlier. So it means at a lower level of development than in other places. So we can expect Africa to be different. And actually, in the early 2000s, several pieces of research had shown that fertility had stalled in several countries, like as in Kenya, in Zimbabwe, in Cameroon, in Ghana, even if there is some disagreement regarding some of these stalls. And in the early 2000s, Shapiro and Tambache, they identified early signs of fertility stalls in urban areas, actually. And Michel Garen, 10 years later, identified stalls or slowdowns in fertility declines in urban fertility in several African countries. So there were signs that stalls could be frequent in urban areas, but these analyses had not, well, they had focused on urban areas as a whole and had not distinguished cities from the rest of urban areas. And they were also done 10 to 20 years ago, and things could have changed since then. Another specificity of Africa that is worth mentioning and that drew our attention was the fairly low level of urbanization and the slow urbanization on the continent. So currently, roughly 40% of Africa's population lives in urban areas compared to 80% in Latin America. And urbanization has slowed down in recent years. Actually, the United Nations, the World Urbanization Prospect, have revised downwards their projections of urbanization in sub-Saharan Africa, partly because of the slowdown of migration to urban areas. So these two factors are also important to understand the impact of fertility trends in urban areas and cities on countrywide fertility trends. So this leads me to the objectives of this presentation. I will focus on fertility transitions in urban areas and especially in cities, and on their links with countrywide and regional fertility trends. And I will draw on the distinction between leaders and drivers of fertility transition that Parfait, who is here, and his colleagues made in a very interesting paper they wrote a few years ago, and which is related to what I will show. And so, said briefly, the leaders are the first, and the drivers are the most influential groups in the fertility transition. And previous research has clearly shown that urban areas and especially cities are leaders in fertility transition. And this is what we discussed in the three-stage model. So this will be shown again. The novelty, let's say, here is that we reconstruct fertility trends over a long period, so starting in the 1980s, so almost 40 years in many countries. And we also use three categories instead of the urban-rural dichotomy that is often used. So we isolate cities, and this may shed light on what could happen in the future in other places of residence. But the main question here is whether it's not whether urban areas are leaders, but whether they are the drivers of fertility transitions, or they are still the drivers of fertility transitions. And to answer these questions, we will identify if fertility has stalled in cities and in other urban areas, and how fertility trends in cities and in urban areas have contributed to changes or have not contributed to changes at the country level or for a broader set of countries in Africa. So the main hypothesis here is that cities and other urban areas are no longer the main drivers of fertility changes in Africa, both because fertility decline has slowed down or has stalled, and because the pace of urbanization has been slow, and that Africa remains mainly, well, the majority of the population still lives in rural areas. And finally, I will touch upon some of the demographic factors that help understand stalls in the cities by looking at the role of migration, by looking at trends in a few proximate determinants of fertility, and also ideal family size. So this part is more an ongoing work, but I will show you, I will share a few results, and we may discuss a little bit more during the discussion. So I will present the data and methods. I won't go into too many details for the methods, but at least a few things that are needed to understand how we did the analysis. We use data from 37 sub-Saharan African countries. So we have 198 surveys in which birth histories were collected and with relevant information on the place of residence. So these are mainly demographic and health surveys, but we also use the UNICEF mixed surveys, world fertility surveys also in some countries, and other surveys like malaria indicator surveys. And one of the tasks we had was to harmonize these data sets, to facilitate the analysis, but also to identify the capital city. And it's not always straightforward with these data. Sometimes it's only possible to isolate a broader region in which the capital city is located. So that was a big task. But we managed to identify definitions that are broadly consistent over time for the capital cities and urban areas. So a few words about the methods. So two broad methods are used here. So the first one consists in reconstructing fertility by place of residence. And I will explain it in a few seconds. So this is used to identify the leaders in the transition, but also to measure if there have been fertility stalls. And the second method is a decomposition method, which allows identifying how much of fertility change is attributable to fertility changes by place of residence and to urbanization. So this is more related to the identification of the drivers of fertility changes. I will skip the detail of the method, but I will illustrate it with a few figures, how we reconstruct fertility trends by place of residence. So I will show it with the example of Harare. And I wonder why I chose Harare, because I cannot pronounce it properly. But so in Zimbabwe, so you see the 9 dots here. These are the values of the total fertility for the 3 years preceding each survey. So this corresponds to the values that are published in the survey report. And it shows that fertility has fluctuated between 3 and 4 children since the late 1990s in Harare. And what we do is to go further back in time and to smooth these trends by pooling several surveys. So with each survey, we can compute fertility for the 15 years preceding the survey. So this is for the 2019 mixed survey, and this for the preceding survey, and for all the surveys. And what we see here is that, well, there is some noise, of course, because the samples in the cities are sometimes small, but overall, these trends match quite well. And actually, it's the case in almost all the cities. And so we pooled all these surveys to reduce the random fluctuations. And we also used splines to smooth the trend. and we identify the stalls as periods where when fertility was not declining or was increasing. So it can be in orange if it's lower than 0.02 child per year, and red when the decline is not significant. So if it's orange or red, it means that fertility is stalling. So here in Harare, since the early 2000s, fertility has been stalling or even slightly increasing between 3 and 4 children. And we find we did similar things for all the countries and in other urban areas and rural areas. So here we see in Zimbabwe that fertility also stalled in other urban areas and in rural areas, roughly at the same time, but at different levels. And well, when we put all this on the same figure, so the green line here is the trend in rural areas. The blue line is in Harare. The brown line, the light brown line, is in other urban areas. So this is one of the exceptions where the capital city and other urban areas are very similar. And the black line is the countrywide fertility trends. And not surprisingly, we see a stall at the country level, since there have been stalls in each of in the 3 places of residence. And in Zimbabwe, the stall is above 4 children. But Zimbabwe is a little bit an exception. So I will comment other trends later. So this is the first part, and the second part of the methods is the decomposition method. So to identify the weight of each of these places of residence in the global change. I will not discuss the equation in detail, but it's a fairly classical decomposition method I use. And the main thing to understand here is that the total fertility change between 2 dates, time 1 and time 2, is the sum of 4 components. The first is the change attributable to fertility changes in the city. So it's the product of fertility changes in the city and of the weight of the city in the total population, actually of women aged 15-49 in the city, in the total population. So it's the sum of this change. It's the sum of the change of fertility in other urban areas and in rural areas. And it's also affected by the change in composition, so by the urbanization component. And we try to estimate this in all the countries. And so to estimate these components, we need estimates of fertility changes, and that's what I just showed before. So it's based on the reconstructed fertility trends. And we also need to have the share of the population in each place of residence over time. And well, again, I won't go into too much detail here. There are different data sources, different approaches to do that. Here we use an indirect method, and it's represented by the continuous line in green, in blue, and in red here in Harare. And they show that around 60% of the population in Zimbabwe lives in rural areas in 2020, and that the share of urban women has increased, but not very rapidly, as shown by the red and the blue curves. And now results of the decomposition in Zimbabwe. And as I said, I will show a few other results later to understand these results. So the dark blue area here, it shows the contribution of fertility changes in the cities. to fertility, to the total fertility changes in the country. This shows the contribution of fertility changes in other urban areas, so the light blue. The green part is the contribution of fertility changes in rural areas, and the gray zone here is the contribution of the urbanization, so the increasing share of women living in urban areas and in cities. And the black line here is the total, so it means the total change. So around 1990, each year fertility was decreasing by around 0.16 children, so almost one child in 6 years. And so we see that before year 2000, fertility was decreasing quite quickly in Zimbabwe. And it was to a large extent driven by changes in rural areas, but also by fertility changes in the cities, in urban areas, and also by urbanization. And since the early 2000s, so you see the orange line, it means that fertility has been stalling from that time. And in this case, the stall is due to the stall in the 3 places of residence. But if we zoom a little bit more on this graph, we see actually that in the cities, the trends in the cities have in fact contributed to increasing fertility, and in other urban areas also. And it has just a little bit been a little bit offset by the urbanization component. So this is the method briefly explained, and now I will show results on a few other countries.
Bruno?
Yes.
There's one question from an audience. So Marlene asks if there are any estimates of variance for these estimates.
I don't have them, but we could, yes. Probably we should, yes, but I don't have them on the slides, and we have not used them actually in the decomposition method. But for the fertility trends, yes, we have them, but for the decomposition method, we have not some.
Thanks.
You have not them, but it's a good point. So, well, yeah, what do we find in other countries? So I first look at the trends by place of residence, and as I said, one of the striking results was that fertility had stalled in many capital cities in Africa, and including in large cities like Lagos or Kinshasa. And when we count the number of stalls by place of residence, we distinguish ongoing stalls and past stalls and no stalls. We find that fertility is currently stable in 17 of the 37 countries, so almost half of the 37 cities. And in 23 of them, there has been a stall at some point since the 1980s. So it's really very frequent. They are less common in other urban areas, but we find 10 ongoing stalls in the 37 countries, and we also find stalls in rural areas and at the country level, but they are less frequent. But we find them, for instance, in Zimbabwe, as I just showed. So I will illustrate with a few cases of stalls in cities to show that they occur at various levels of fertility in different regions. For instance, well, let's start with Niamey in Niger, where fertility has stalled at about 5 children since the early 2000s. Well, in Lagos, Nigeria, fertility has also stalled for about 20 years, a little bit below 4 children. And we find also stalls in Accra at lower levels, but around 3 children per woman, also since the early 2000s. And in Nairobi, we have similar findings. And finally, last example, but we could go on for many countries in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, where fertility has slightly increased since roughly 2005. So I will not explain what is going on, and I will not be able to explain what is going on in each of these cities, but I will come back on a few of them later. But I just want to highlight that they are very frequent and they happen in various countries from different regions and at various fertility levels. We find stalls in the other urban areas, as I said. Usually they are shorter, they are less numerous, but they do exist also, as in Benin. It has stalled at around 5 children, or in Congo, but also in Togo or in Namibia, for instance. And in rural areas, they are much less frequent, but we find them in Namibia also, and Zimbabwe. I already showed that one, so I won't discuss it anymore. So this was for the stalls, and now I will focus more on the driver's part. What is the impact of fertility trends in cities and urban areas on overall fertility changes? I already illustrated in the case of Zimbabwe. I will illustrate it with another example here. But we have the result for the 37 countries actually, and I will also show later results for 22 African countries grouped together. So this is not a large country, but it's a fairly clear example, so that's why I selected it. It's Benin. And as I said before, Benin has experienced a stall both in the capital cities, or in Cotonou. Well, it's not the capital, but it's the largest city, and in other urban areas. But in contrast, fertility has continued decreasing slowly, but decreasing in rural areas. And at the country level, we see a stall since roughly 2005 at around 6 children. And yes, the decomposition method here on the right-hand side of the slide shows that the decrease in the 1990s was driven by the decline in rural areas, but also to a fairly large extent by the decline in other urban areas and in the city, and slightly by urbanization. In the most recent period, the fertility changes in the city and in other urban areas don't contribute, or contribute only very slightly to the fertility decrease, which is mainly driven by changes in rural areas, but actually it's to some extent offset by a leveling off or even a reversal of urbanization. So there are, of course, a variety of situations across countries, but often the stalls in cities and in other urban areas have contributed to slowdowns in fertility declines at the country level, and in many countries, fertility changes are now mainly driven by changes in rural areas, and to a lesser extent by urbanization. Okay, I will now show global estimates for sub-Saharan Africa. So global, I mean here on 22 countries. So we had to select the number of countries to have data covering the whole period in all the countries, and the period was also a little bit reduced from 1990 to 2013. But these 22 countries cover 74% of sub-Saharan Africa's population. We have pulled the surveys and we have used weights by country and place of residence to compute the average for Africa. I should mention here that the results are a little bit sensitive to the choice of the period, and so to the number of countries we include, as well as to the aggregation methods. But some of them are clearly robust, and I will comment these ones. So we can compute fertility changes by place of residence for these 22 countries together, and we find in blue that fertility in capital cities in Africa is clearly lower than in other places of residence. So there are clear leaders, but fertility has stalled for roughly 20 years, 15 years. In other urban areas, the decrease has been quite slow, and in rural areas, it first slightly increased, and then from roughly 2005, it started decreasing more quickly. So this is the first part. And regarding the urbanization part, we see that 60% of the population still lives in rural areas, and it's not changing very fast. And actually, in the cities, in blue, the share of the population has remained fairly stable, so the increase is mainly in other urban areas. And when we combine these two trends, we obtain the contribution of fertility changes in each place of residence on overall fertility changes, and the contribution of changes in the composition of the population. So until the late 1990s, cities in dark blue and urban areas in light blue were the drivers of fertility changes. Changes were slow, but fertility was declining in these 22 countries. And it was also helped by the urbanization components. Then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a slowdown, and it was mainly the result of the increase in rural areas, but also of the slowdown in the cities and other urban areas. And then from 2005, the decrease is largely driven by the what's happening in rural areas, and actually the changes in cities have a very small impact on fertility change in the 22 countries as a whole, and the urbanization component is also quite low. Changes in other urban areas have a substantial effect, but much lower than what's happening in rural areas. So in a sense, this summarizes all the main results, if you want. And I will finish this presentation with a few results on some factors that may contribute to stalls in the cities. So there's no simple answer, of course, and I don't have the answer. And probably the reasons vary across cities. And certainly case studies and field work would be very useful to understand what is going on in a detailed way in these cities. But we explored a few questions using DHS surveys, or survey data again. And a first possibility is that these stalls are the result of inflows of immigrants, migrants to cities with higher fertility than natives. It's not easy to answer this question because we don't always have the data for it, but in a few countries, it's possible to compare fertility trends in the cities among migrants and among non-migrants. So it gives some information regarding that hypothesis. And actually, our results suggest that migration is not the main issue, the main factor leading to these stalls. I will briefly show a few results where we compare fertility trends in the capital city among migrants. This is in Cotonou, migrants in Cotonou, and among non-migrants also in Cotonou. And we find stalls both among migrants and non-migrants, and actually fertility levels of migrants and non-migrants are fairly similar. So this makes us think that migration is not at the heart of this stall in Cotonou. And we find similar things in Lagos. This is a trend for migrants, for non-migrants. We have small data sets, so large confidence intervals, but this goes in the same direction, and in Yaoundé, Douala, in Cameroon also. So it's not always the case. For instance, in Ghana, it's not the case, but in most of the countries we looked at, it's the case. But we cannot rule out the possibility that in some countries, in some cities, migrants do have an impact on these stores. Second level of explanation, let's say, we also looked at the proximate determinants of fertility in some of these cities to go beyond the surface, to see what kind of behavioral and biological factors may have influenced these stalls. And here we focus on 3 proximate determinants that have a major impact on fertility. So this is sexual exposure, postpartum infecundability, which is the length of the period after giving birth, during which pregnancy is not possible, and contraceptive use among sexually active women. And with DHS data, we can measure the fertility inhibiting effect of these proximate determinants. And these are the CM, CI, CC indices. And we can also measure their combined effect on fertility. And this is the product of these indices represented in black. So I will briefly comment what we find in Yaoundé and Douala for you to see what is happening in that city, at least in terms of proximate determinants. In green, this is the fertility inhibiting effect of contraception. Its value is between 0.6 and 0.7, so it means that fertility is 30 to 40% lower than it would be without contraception. And actually, interestingly, between the 1990s and 2018, the latest survey, contraceptive changes did not contribute to fertility decline. Actually, they rather contributed to fertility increase, slightly, but clearly. The blue line here, it represents the fertility inhibiting effect of postpartum infecundability, and it also, the trend in fecundability also contributed to higher fertility in Yaoundé and Douala. Sexual exposure and mainly age at first union contributed to decreasing fertility, so that's the red line. But when we combine these 3 trends together, the trend is stable. So the combined effect of these changes contribute to stalling fertility. And actually, we did that for all the cities. Just another example. So in another part of Africa, it's Nairobi. So we also see in recent years, postpartum infecundability, so it's related to breastfeeding and sexual abstinence, postpartum sexual abstinence. It has contributed to higher fertility. Sexual exposure has not changed in recent years. Contraceptive use contributed to lower fertility, but when we combine these three trends, it leads to stable fertility, at least based on the values of these proximate determinants.
Bruno?
Yes?
Sorry, one clarification question from Carrie. How are you measuring sexually active? Is it in the last 30 days or a longer period?
That's a good question. Actually, we used the revised version of Baumgart's model, and I should go back in my Stata code or David's Stata code to be sure and not tell you lies. But it's the Baumgart's method.
Thank you.
Sorry, not to be more precise than that. The 2015 revised method. And last thing we looked at, we are currently looking at, and actually David will present some of these results at the PAA next week. Do these stalls in cities reflect a high demand for children or high ideal family size? So here I will be very brief, but we have more detailed results on trends in wanted fertility and unwanted fertility. The main finding here is that, I do not expect you to read all these graphs, but the yellow line is the trend in ideal family size in these cities over time. And a major result is that it's fairly high in many cities, around 4 or even 5 children. So the ideal family size is fairly high. And in many places, it has not decreased substantially. And when we compute trends in wanted fertility and unwanted fertility by combining ideal family size and birth histories, we find that actually the stalls are stalls in wanted fertility for the most part. So it's not reflecting growing unwanted fertility in these cities. So I think I'm running out of time soon, so it's the time to conclude. And I will mainly briefly summarize or wrap up the main results. And I hope you will have ideas to enrich the discussion or the implications of these results. But so fertility has stalled in many cities and in urban areas to some extent, and cities are no longer drivers of fertility changes. And declines are mainly driven by rural areas and to a lesser extent by urban areas, other urban areas. And overall, these stalls have contributed to slower fertility changes in African countries. Why has it stalled? As I said, we don't have the answer, but we have looked at some of the demographic mechanisms, and we find that probably migration is not the main factor. We see that a lot is going on in terms of proximate determinants, and especially postpartum infecundability has decreased and contributed to increased fertility in many cities. And when this is combined with slowly increasing contraceptive use or stalls in contraceptive use, it can lead to fertility stalls. And this is in a context where the demand for children is still high. So most people want 3, 4, 5 children. So it's not surprising to see fertility stalling in this case. So clearly, further research is needed to better understand what is going on in these cities and the possible implications on the future of fertility transitions in Africa, as well as on the future of urbanization in Africa and population growth in Africa as a whole. And a final question is maybe to understand if what is happening now in cities heralds trends that could happen in other places of residence in the future. But again, we don't have the answer. So I will stop here for today. Thank you very much for your attention and for your questions if you have.
So thank you so much, Bruno, for a very interesting talk. Now I'd like to open up the floor for Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments for Bruno, please raise your hand by clicking on the hand icon on the reactions on your Zoom screen. I'll call out your names as I see them, then please unmute yourself and ask your questions. I see Shelley.
Hello, thank you, Bruno. This was very interesting and I really enjoyed it. I have worked for a long time in Benin and I was interested to see that highlighted. So thank you for that. And I guess my question to you is your definition of rural and urban areas. Over the years in Benin, Cotonou has expanded to include almost all of southern Benin. So I don't know, when you talk about the rural areas as drivers in the fall and fertility, I don't know how official that is. And I'm sure that happens in many other cities, that the central cities have just grown with huge exurbs and things like that. And so they're not totally rural areas anymore, not like in other parts of the country. And I just didn't know if maybe that's where the driver is in kind of these exurbs or what. So that's my question. You are nodding as if you understood it, so I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point. Actually, that's something we should look, at least for some countries, with more detail. And one way to maybe better grasp the possible expanding of the limits of the cities is to use the GPS coordinates. And Jamaica, who is here, I think, did that. It's a very, very time-consuming way to do that, but that would definitely be useful to do to check it. And unfortunately, that's part of the problem when we do these kinds of comparative analysis. We don't know all these contexts perfectly, so it's very good to hear from you about Benin.
Great. Tom, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Bruno. I've been very impressed with the study from the very beginning. I think it goes against what a lot of people think is going on in Africa and infertility across the world. I have two questions. One, while it's not really the focus of your study, do you have any idea if there are sustained differences between groups within urban areas? For example, more highly educated people and low educated people? Or is this high level of fertility and fertility preferences very broad across all social classes and groups would be the first question. And if there are sharp differences, that might point the way towards change. If there are no sharp differences, that really, it's an interesting finding. The second question is more just a general issue. And in recent years, there's been a lot of debate and discussion about world population projections, with the UN Population Division, which is kind of the gold standard, having higher projections of future population. And first Lutz and his group in Vienna, and more recently the IHME in Seattle, have been assuming a very rapid decline in fertility. And Lutz has been saying that's because of education. your results, at least for sub-Saharan Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa is going to be a driver of population growth in the future, seem to point that probably population division is right, that the higher population, it's unlikely that population growth is going to fall at the pace that Lutz, for example, had presumed. Am I reading your results right? Would that be your perception? I think this is not a trivial point because higher population growth has enormous potential effects on development prospects for Africa and even achieving a population environment economy balance in the long term.
Okay, hello, Tom. Tom was my boss when I was in Montreal, actually. So, yeah. First questions: what is happening within urban areas? I could not answer. I know some people have worked more than me on these issues, and again, Jamaica probably could give more details than me on some cities. But it's clear that there is a large heterogeneity in some urban areas. And in another work, what we found, for instance, in Lagos, but also in Niamey, is that even among better educated women and better educated women in the cities, demand for children was high and fertility was high. So in some cities, fertility is high even among the better educated women, but it's clearly not the case everywhere. But really, I could not give more detail on that right now. But probably other people have the answer. And regarding the population projections, I have, yeah, clearly it's related to this issue of future population growth, future trends in fertility and population growth. I've thought a little bit about that, but I've not done projections myself. So honestly, I could not answer properly regarding the future trend of fertility in Africa. But I have the feeling that things are not moving very fast currently. Doesn't mean that it could not change in the future, but I would not bet too much on the fact that fertility would be declining very fast. But you know, I don't have at this stage really strong arguments for that. So it's more a feeling than a scientific point of view.
Great. Next, Jeff, please go ahead.
Thank you, Toshko. Thank you, Professor Schoumaker. This has been a fascinating presentation and very thought-provoking. And two things struck me. I was struck by the variability in some of the other graphs and looking at migration patterns, and wondered if there are any overlays around political stability or instability in rural areas that may be changing migration patterns or the types of people who are migrating. So that more is a variability issue than it really seems to play out against some of the rest of what you were doing. But the bigger question I would have is there anything significantly different in women's economic opportunity in receiving urban areas or peri-urban areas? In other words, in places where we've seen fertility decline continue, in those, whether historically or now, are there greater economic opportunity, and particularly economic opportunity for women, than there may currently be, or there may have been in the last 20 years in these places where we're seeing it stalled? And is that a partial driver on both fertility preference and, and outcomes?
Thank you for your question. And well, again, I'm sorry, I will not have very serious answers. But for migration, actually, the data we have on migration and fertility is quite limited. So it's a little bit difficult to analyze what is going on in terms of migration with DHS data. And well, in some countries, surely there can be migration linked to crisis or to conflicts, but we have not looked at it, at least in this context. And regarding women's economic opportunities and the place where they live, yes, again, certainly that's a good point that someone should look at. We have not looked at it currently, so I cannot give you an answer on this, but probably some people in the audience have know this better than me.
Thank you. Next, Charlotte.
Hi, thank you so much for the great presentation. That was very interesting. I'm just curious whether you've seen patterns or similarities in these capital cities and urban areas that have seen, you know, stalls versus areas that may not have seen as much of a stall in fertility decline. And I know that there's some variation. So have you seen any particular patterns, whether geographic or otherwise?
Thank you for your question. Actually, no. There's probably, I mean, yes, in some, for example, in Nigeria, Benin, Togo, patterns are very similar, and these are neighboring countries. So one may wonder if there is some correlation between what we find in these neighboring countries. But actually, what struck us is that we find these stalls in many in various areas in Africa at various levels. So we have not looked yet very deeply for patterns, but if there is one, it's not obvious. We find stalls in Central Africa, like in Cameroon, in Congo, well, in Kinshasa, in Brazzaville, at fairly similar levels. But I don't know if it's related to the fact that these countries are neighbors or close together, or if it's something else. I don't know, but something to look at. Yes.
Thank you.
So next, Jacob, please go ahead with your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Like others, I very much appreciated the quality and the time you devoted to exploring and explaining these patterns in sub-Saharan Africa. My questions, I think, are probably two. One will build on the question by Jeff in terms of economic opportunities. Now, when you are looking at the composition, maybe the next step is to look at educational composition, look at the places of employment, those who are employed in the formal sector and in the informal sector, and look at maybe economic crisis shock and responses to those. Because if you look at the cities and urban areas in the past, chances are that most of the women who migrated and educated will probably be in the formal sector. Now, in the latter strain of migrants and people who grow up, maybe there's a possibility of downplayed expectation of maybe achievement that is possible. So more and more people are reflecting traditional values rather than moving more into the formal sector. It would be nice to look at these compositional differences within cities. Along the same line, it would be nice to look at what has happened in Addis Ababa, because I know there have been studies of the fertility trends in Addis Ababa and how it's different from other parts of Ethiopia and what is driving that. So that's one type of a question and maybe comment. The second one is along the lines of cities as leaders. We tend to take leaders as cities as centers of innovation. So from what you are saying, if cities are no longer leaders in TFR, are they still leaders in innovation from your own? I'm asking to go beyond data now, just to tell us in terms of what to expect, because some foundations are taking cities as places of innovation, as leaders in innovation behavior that can spread through maybe diffusion to rural areas. So what are we saying then? Are cities still leaders in innovation, innovative behavior, or are they not anymore? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your comments and ideas. And yes, probably using decomposition methods for other factors like education or economic factors would be really useful and interesting. So we have not done it, but clearly that would be interesting. Now the difficulty is that here we wanted to make a kind of a global approach using similar methods for all the cities, all the countries. For more detailed analysis, I think we have to focus on case studies. I think because definitions become really a problem, and sometimes we have problems with sample sizes and so on. So we have not tried it, and I don't think we will do, but maybe on some specific cities. You mentioned Addis Ababa. I didn't talk about Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. Actually, it's one of the few cases in Africa where fertility is below replacement level. One of the few cities where it's, I don't remember the exact value, but it's probably 1.6 or 1.7, I don't know. So I did not mention it because it's not a stall when we talk about stall, but clearly it's an interesting setting to look at when we look at fertility changes in cities in Africa. And regarding the innovation, again, I'm sorry, I don't know, so I don't want to tell stupid things. What we looked at was again the broad pattern, and we find some unexpected findings. Now I think we other people, or maybe we later can look at other aspects of these trends, but I don't know if the cities are leaders in terms of innovation.
Thank you. So Clive, please go ahead. Yes.
There's actually a good question from Sadhu in the chat. Are you able to see it, or would you like me to read it?
Yes. Let's go to, thank you, Devin. And I know there are some interesting discussions going on in the chat, which I know that Bruno is not able to see. So I would like to invite Jason and Sadhu to share their comments. But let's first go to Clive. I see his hands up, but thank you, Devin, for helping to monitor.
Thank you, Bruno, for the analysis. My question is about general urbanization trends. I do remember at some point it was forecast that I think around 2010, 36% of the population in Africa was urban, and it was projected to increase to, I think, 50% by a certain year. So what does this analysis mean for general urbanization trends in Africa in the coming years? And there was also some of the analysis showed that a large proportion of the population, of the urban population in most of the African cities was living in informal settlements. Does this analysis go close to showing where the population is living, and of course, some of the underlying poverty issues as well? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the second question.
Yeah, the second question is about the proportion of urban population living in urban informal settlements, also known as slums. is the store? What does the store mean for the proportion of urban population living in those, and of course some of the other socio-economic issues like poverty? Is that what's the impact of the store? Thanks.
Thank you also for the interesting questions. So regarding urban trends, well, my first thought would be that because fertility is higher than expected, or at least not decreasing fast, this would lead to higher urban growth and to maybe higher urbanization levels. But as I mentioned, there is also the migration component that has led to, at least in some countries, to slower urbanization. So, and migration interacts with fertility. So it's a little bit difficult to predict what would be the impact on urbanization. And actually, the world urbanization prospects, they don't use, well, to my knowledge, they don't use data on fertility and mortality and migration to project the share of women or the share of people in urban areas. They use more methods based on differences in growth rates. And so it's difficult to clearly identify what would be the impacts. But what we find here is that, and it's in line with what my colleague Philippe Bocquier found, it's that urban growth in Africa is to a large extent the result of natural increase. So the difference between births and deaths and less, and it's less dependent on migration. So this is consistent with the fact that fertility remains high in urban areas and in cities. And regarding the informal settlements, we didn't look at that, and we know it's an important question, and both for understanding what is going on in the cities in terms of fertility behavior, and also to understand the possible impact of urban growth, driven partly by high fertility on on informal settlements. Again, I think it's we need more case studies based on maybe other types of data. There are very interesting. There's very interesting work in Accra or in Ouagadougou using population surveillance, demographic surveillance systems. I think it's, yeah, they are better suited than demographic and health surveys for looking at these questions. But maybe some people have other ideas about that.
Thank you, Bruno. So we just have a couple more minutes before we go to closing remarks. I'd like to invite Jason and Sadhu. You had some interesting comments that you shared on the chat box. Would you like to share them with Bruno?
Thank you. I don't know if my English is too good for him. I will try to be comprehensive. My comment is that in African sub-Saharan cities, generally the cities are playing social role more than economic role. And there is a high level of polarization that in rural areas, there is less of infrastructure like education or health infrastructures. So when rural families grow, the family tend to move to cities to give children opportunities for education, health, and employment. Is this can also explain the fact that the demographic structure does not really change in cities. So the fertility will remain at the same level when we move from the past to the future. Is this clear? I don't know.
Yet. Yeah, it's interesting, and again, there's a little bit of lack of data to really look at that in many countries, but there have been some work in some cities on these issues, and it's indeed interesting to look at that more deeply. But we did not.
Thank you. Jason, we have 1 minute if you'd like to share your remarks.
Thanks. I've just shared a number of resources in the chat, Bruno and other participants that look at some of the contraceptive prevalence trends that I think support some of your findings. A bit of a convergence in many countries in the contraceptive prevalence among wealth groups, with most of the growth occurring in low wealth groups and middle wealth groups, and little in the upper wealth groups. I'm not saying quintiles because these aren't quintiles; these are actual wealth groups. So I think the other thing on the ideal family size, I shared a resource that you can look at in the future on the relationship between contraceptive use and ideal family size. That also suggests that that gains in contraceptive prevalence have largely been in those spaces where ideal family size, where there was a large gap between, or we calling a potential use gap between contraceptive prevalence and the ideal family size, and that we may be approaching limits to growth without changes in the in ideal family size, or changes in what people perceive as their desire for further contraceptive use and for fertility or avoiding unintended pregnancy. So just some resources for you to look at in the future. Thanks, Toshiko.
Great.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for your very thoughtful questions and comments. Now I'd like to turn it over to Parfait to provide some closing remarks. Parfait, over to you now.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and an easy job for me to close this session. I think my job as a closer is just as easy as Barbara's job was in introducing Bruno. This is in fact because Bruno needs no introduction, and he actually needs no conclusion. He needs no introduction because if you look at the literature on African fertility, on fertility stalls, he has become, over the last 12 years, one of the leading figures in advancing knowledge there. If you just sort of Google stalls, I think that's going to be one of the top 3 names to come, the other 2 being Bongards and Tom Moultrie. But I would argue that Bruno's contribution have also actually been the widest of everybody in that sort of particular area. It's been wide because he has both contributed to the critique as well as constructive advance of this literature. It didn't take the notion of stalls at face value. It was actually very early in critiquing this notion and pushing us hard to actually document the reality of stalls, whether it was real or a spurious observation. His work was also wide in a sense, and you could see this in today's talk, that it was sort of broad in terms of the countries covered, as well as the historical depth covered. And so this presentation here was actually a good example of seeing how far and wide he was able to look at the fertility trends in the area. And finally, Bruno has contributed both to the evidence as well as the methods. You could see here that he's innovating in how we can begin to think about decomposing the trends and understanding how different groups contribute to the broad change. And I think some of these contributions here are actually going to be useful to everybody who's working in that particular area as we move forward. So he really needs no introduction. And this also, his presentation today doesn't need really me to conclude, because his final points were pretty clear. At the PRB, we are very often bent on telling people that they should conclude in 3 main points. And you could see that he had 3 main messages to take home. And if I can repeat these messages, number 1, urban areas are no longer in the driver's seat. They are stalls, and urban areas are no longer in the driver's seat. So that's one important thing to consider. The second is that there's a slow rise in contraceptive use, and there's still a persistent high demand for fertility. Ideal size remains very relatively high. It hasn't really declined steeply. And so there's further research that's needed, both on the consequences of this stalled transition, as well as the causes of this stalled transition. And I think, given the audience that we have in the room, there's actually work for all of us. There's work for folks at the PRB. There's work for folks who are coming from the family planning organizations. Jason and Clive and many others are actually, I'm glad they were able to share resources here. There's work for folks who come from DHS and the extent to which we can actually tweak the question that we formulate to maybe better understand this notion of ideal family size. Is there room to dig a little bit deeper, or to address Shelley McGuire's question about what is rural and what is urban and how these boundaries have changed over time? There's work for, Kerry has left, but also there's actually a fair amount of work for folks on that, and as well as other researchers who are working in that particular area. So I cannot summarize the work that is going to be needed. I'm going to just say a couple of things about work that can be done and consequences. One obvious line of research that we can explore is how having a stalled fertility transition is going to affect the demographic shift in age structure, whether the shift is going to be so flat that we don't actually harness a demographic dividend. And secondly, whether the diversity or the differences in the transition, the fertility transition is going to lead to greater economic inequality, to the extent that the urban areas as leading, even if they're not driving, to the extent that you have differences across wealth groups. To what extent is this going to exacerbate the economic inequality that we find in Africa? So these are important questions that I think are understudied. And to look at the causes of these stalls, I think this Bruno has really advanced sort of the geographic angle, looking at rural versus urban and other cities. But there's also a reason to look at what are called vertical differences, differences across classes. To what extent the movement is led by top wealth quintile versus middle wealth quintile. And this is actually very important. And I shared a resource, a paper that just came out of the Lancet that actually tries to explore both the geographic dimension that Bruno is studying, but also the socioeconomic or vertical direction. The methods that he uses the decomposition methods that he uses to document the changes can also be tweaked and refined to look at questions about changes in the timing of fertility, essentially looking at how the quantum and tempo of fertility change really have contributed to this broad transformation, as well as questions about how much of it was driven by wanted versus unwanted fertility. And in fact, the question that he raised about the patterns of contraceptive use and the resources that Jason provided actually set the stage for interesting research to see how much of the trend in contraceptive use reflects access, limited access, versus limited demand. And so there's a lot of work for all of us. Again, I'd like to commend Bruno for the excellence of his continued work in this area, and the PRB for convening this and giving us an opportunity not just to listen to good research, but also to contribute and exchange ideas and progress together in this line of work. Thank you.